I found a room full of photos of a woman who had my exact face. My husband never mentioned her once.
There's a moment, right before you sign your name away, where your hand hovers over the paper, and some animal part of your brain screams, "Don't." I didn't listen. I remember the pen more than anything. Heavy, cold, expensive. My father's name was typed at the top of that contract. $181,000. Paid in full. The letter said, paid, past tense, like it was already done, like I had no choice left to make. I looked up at the woman across the table. Margaret Whitfield had a smile that never once touched her eyes, and that day she used it on me like a weapon. "Sign at the bottom, dear," she told me, "right where I've marked it." I asked her what would happen after I signed it. She just smiled wider and said I'd become part of the family. Wasn't that what I wanted? What I didn't know, what none of them told me, was that I wasn't the one being rescued that day. I was the one being collected. By the end of this story, you're going to find out the debt was never really about my father at all. But before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. My name is Sophia Reyes, 26 years old, second grade teacher, part-time waitress on weekends, because a teacher's salary in South Carolina doesn't cover rent, groceries, and a father drowning in debt he never told me about until it was almost too late. My dad, Robert Reyes, raised me alone after my mom died when I was 19. Ovarian cancer. He never once complained about the medical bills that came after. He just quietly took out loans, then more loans to pay the loans. Then he sank what little he had left into a restaurant he thought would save us. It didn't. By the time I found out how bad things were, collection agencies were calling 5 times a day. He was going to lose the house, the same house where my mother was buried just down the road, where her name sat on a bench outside the library, where everyone in town still knew us. When I confronted him about it, he told me he didn't want me to know, that this wasn't my problem to fix. I told him they were threatening to take the house. He just went quiet with shame. I want you to understand something about me before this story gets dark. I wasn't naive. I wasn't some fairy tale girl waiting for a rich family to save her. I was exhausted. I was scared, and I would have done almost anything to keep my father from losing the last piece of my mother he had left. That's when Daniel Whitfield walked back into my life. We'd dated briefly in college, before his family pulled him back into their world, a world of textile mills turned real estate empire, of a name that meant something in Charleston, the way old money always means something in the South. We hadn't spoken in 4 years. Then, 3 weeks after my father's house went into foreclosure proceedings, Daniel showed up at the diner where I waitressed. He told me he'd heard about my dad, and that he was sorry, and he meant it. I asked him, guarded, why he was really there. He hesitated before answering. His family, he said, wanted to meet me. I should have asked why. That's the detail I skipped past. That's the thread I should have pulled. But desperation makes you incurious. Desperation makes you grateful for a door opening, even when you can't see what's on the other side of it. The Whitfield estate looked like something out of a plantation-era postcard, if postcards came with a family that smiled at you like they already owned you. Margaret Whitfield greeted me at the door like we were old friends. "We've heard so much about you," she said. That should have scared me. They'd heard so much about a woman Daniel hadn't spoken to in 4 years. They sat me down in a study lined with portraits, stern men in stiff collars, going back generations. Margaret poured tea nobody drank, and then, without any warm-up at all, she said the sentence that changed my life. She said they'd like to pay off my father's debt, all of it, that night, if I wanted. I was stunned. I asked her why she'd do that. She smiled and told me it was because Daniel cared for me, and because family takes care of family. Family. I wasn't family. Not yet. I almost said that out loud. Instead, I looked at Daniel, hoping he'd explain, hoping he'd say something that made this make sense. He just nodded, like this was normal, like this was fine. Then, quietly, not quite meeting my eyes, he told me to just say yes. There it was. The first crack, so small I convinced myself I'd imagined it. He wasn't excited. He wasn't romantic about it. He looked like a man asking me to sign something he didn't fully agree with either. I should have asked what family required of me in return. I didn't. I called my father that night. He told me, voice breaking, that I didn't have to do this for him. I told him I loved Daniel, that it was fine, that it was really fine. I lied to my father for the first time in my life that night. Not about loving Daniel. That part, at the time, was true. I lied about the fine part. Because nothing about a stranger paying off a $181,000 debt in one sitting, with no interest, no conditions spoken out loud, is fine. There was a contract. Margaret's lawyer, a thin, quiet man named Mr. Pierce, slid it across the table 3 days later and told me it was standard prenuptial language, nothing out of the ordinary. 12 pages. I read maybe 4 of them carefully. On page 9, there was a clause about a family trust I didn't understand and didn't ask about. I told myself lawyers write confusing things on purpose. I told myself it didn't matter. I signed it anyway. The wedding happened fast. 6 weeks fast. My father walked me down an aisle of white orchids paid for by people we'd known for 6 weeks, and I remember thinking, this is either the luckiest day of my life or the day I stopped being able to see the whole board. The Whitfield house ran on rules nobody wrote down but everybody knew. Dinner at 7, sharp. No discussing money at the table. No wandering the East Wing, and absolutely, under any circumstance, no asking about someone named Vivian. I didn't even know who Vivian was for the first 2 weeks. I just knew her name made a room go cold. I met the rest of the family slowly. There was Claire, Daniel's younger sister, sharp-tongued and watchful, the only one who ever looked at me like she felt sorry for something. She caught me alone in a hallway once and told me, quietly, that I was doing better than she thought I would. When I asked her better at what, she just said, surviving here, and walked away. Then there was Eleanor, the housekeeper who'd worked for the family for over 30 years. She was kind to me in the way people are kind to something they feel guilty about. One afternoon, handing me tea, she told me I reminded her of someone. When I asked who, she caught herself, said no one, and told me to drink my tea. Daniel, meanwhile, was 2 different men. In private, he was warm. He'd bring me coffee before I asked, remember which of my students I was worried about, hold me like he meant it. But the moment his mother entered a room, something in him folded up small. He'd go quiet. He'd agree with things I knew he didn't believe. I told myself every family had its dynamics. I told myself this one just had more money attached to its dysfunction. Then, 3 weeks into the marriage, I found the locked door. Every door in that house was original to the 1890s. Except one. A door at the end of the East Wing. The wing I'd been told, more than once, not to wander into. With a brand new digital keypad lock, completely out of place against the antique wood. I asked Daniel about it over dinner, casually, the way you test a fence to see if it's electrified. What was behind the locked door? I wanted to know. He answered too fast. Storage, he said. Old furniture. Old furniture doesn't need a keypad lock installed in the last 5 years. I know, because I noticed the drill marks were still clean in the wood frame. I let it go. For a week. Then Eleanor made a mistake. She left a ring of keys on the hallway table while carrying linens, and among them was a small paper tag that read, in faded pencil, V's room. At night, I stood outside that door for 11 minutes before I found the courage, or the stupidity, to try the keypad with the only 4-digit number I could think of, Daniel's birthday. It didn't work. Neither did mine. Neither did their wedding date. It worked on my mother's birthday. I want you to sit with that for a second, because I had to. A door inside my husband's family estate, a door I was forbidden from opening, unlocked with the birth date of a woman who had never set foot in that house in her life. I didn't understand it yet, but my hands were shaking as I pushed the door open. It wasn't furniture. It was a study, smaller than the others, but lived in, dusted regularly by someone who clearly still cared about it. Photographs lined the walls. A woman, young, maybe early 20s in most of them, with a face that made my stomach drop before my mind caught up to why. She looked like me, not similar, like me, the same jaw, the same eyes. On the desk sat a framed photo of that same woman standing beside a man I didn't recognize at first, until I looked closer and realized it was my own grandfather. My mother's father, dead 11 years before I was even born. A man I only knew from one faded photograph my mother kept on our mantel my entire childhood. I found a folder on the desk, unlocked, like it was waiting for someone. Inside were newspaper clippings from decades earlier, a business dispute, a lawsuit, the words Reyes Textile Holdings in a headline next to Whitfield, in a way that made my ears ring. And a name I had never once heard in my life, printed clean across the top of a legal document. Vivian Reyes Whitfield. Reyes. My name. Attached to a woman who apparently once belonged to this family too. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. Margaret was in the doorway, her voice like ice cracking. She told me I shouldn't be in there. I asked her who Vivian was, and why she had my last name. There was a long, calculating pause before she finally said it was time I understood exactly what I'd signed up for. Margaret told me the story slowly, deliberately, like she'd rehearsed it for years, and was finally allowed to say it out loud. 40 years ago, her father-in-law and my great-grandfather had been business partners. Reyes Textile Holdings, my family's company, merged with the Whitfields. It was supposed to be an equal partnership. It wasn't. My husband's family forced my family out through fraud, falsified signatures, a lawsuit my great-grandfather couldn't afford to win. I told her that had nothing to do with me. She said it had everything to do with me. Because the settlement, the one her family's lawyers had buried for decades, included a binding clause. If a Reyes descendant and a Whitfield descendant were ever united by marriage, the original 50% ownership stake would be restored. Fully, legally, automatically. I sat there doing math I didn't want to do. 50% of an empire worth, I found out later, just under $400 million. I whispered that she hadn't paid off my father's debt because she cared about me. She was coldly honest with me for the first time all night. She said she'd paid it off because for 40 years, that clause had sat there like a bomb no one could defuse. Except through marriage. Vivian, she said, was supposed to be the one, Daniel's twin sister. She was meant to marry into a different branch of the Reyes line, years ago, to settle it quietly, permanently, before it ever became public. She refused. She ran. And 2 years later she was gone. A car accident on a coastal road, in the rain, or so the report said. I asked her what she meant by, or so the report said. She didn't answer. Instead, she told me that when they'd heard her son had once dated a Reyes girl in college, and that her father happened to be drowning in debt at the exact moment they needed this settled before a 20-year legal window closed, they didn't see coincidence. They saw an opportunity to finally close this out. Quietly, permanently, on their terms, not mine, not even Daniel's apparently. I had been found, not fallen in love with, selected, not chosen. Every warm moment, every dinner, every touch of his hand. I didn't know anymore which parts had been real, and which parts had been a strategy with a start date and a deadline. I asked her if Daniel knew all of this. She didn't answer that either, and that silence was louder than anything she'd said to me all night. I found Daniel that night in our room and asked him directly. Did he know? When he walked into that diner and said his family wanted to meet me, did he already know what I was worth to them? He sat down heavily, head in his hands, before he answered. Not at first, he told me. He knew there was an old family dispute. He knew Vivian was supposed to fix it and hadn't. But he didn't know my name was in the settlement documents until his mother showed him, 3 days before he found me at that diner. 3 days. He'd known for 3 days and let me believe he had simply missed me. He told me quietly that missing me had never been a lie, but he wasn't going to stand there and tell me he hadn't known what his family needed. He had, and he let it happen anyway, because, he said, it was the only way he knew how to have me without them destroying us for it. I didn't know whether to believe him. I still don't fully know, even now, telling you this. What I did know, in that moment, was that I had a choice to make. I could stay, play the role they'd built for me, live inside a marriage constructed out of a decades-old fraud, or I could fight. I chose to find out exactly how much power I actually had. I found a lawyer 2 towns over, someone with zero connection to the Whitfields, and laid the settlement documents out on her desk. Her name was Diane Morales, and she told me something I hadn't let myself consider yet. If the original 1980s settlement had been procured through fraud, the way I was describing, then the entire agreement, including the marriage clause, could be void, which meant the Whitfields didn't just owe my family an apology. I asked her what they owed us. She said that if what was in that folder was real and verifiable, my family might have an independent legal claim to that 50% stake, not because of my marriage, but because the original fraud never should have held up in court in the first place. I sat in that office and felt something shift inside my chest. For weeks I had seen myself as a pawn moved across a board I didn't build. But the truth was bigger and stranger than that. I wasn't just leverage in their scheme. I was a threat to it. I always had been. They just needed me married and quiet before I ever found that out. Claire found me a few days later, finally ready to talk. She told me I needed to know something before I went to war with this family. Vivian, she said, hadn't died in an accident. I froze and asked her what she meant. She told me Vivian had found the same folder I'd found. She'd threatened to go public, to expose the fraud, to refuse the arranged marriage, to blow the whole settlement wide open in the press before the 20-year legal window closed on its own. 2 weeks later, she was dead. Their mother called it an accident. Claire had never believed that. Neither had Daniel, not really. She told me he'd spent 6 years trying to protect me from ending up the same way, even if it meant lying to me to keep me close enough to control the outcome. Everything rearranged itself in my head in that one moment. Daniel hadn't married me only to serve his mother's plan. Somewhere in the middle of it, twisted and imperfect as it was, he'd been trying to keep me alive. That didn't make what he did okay. But it changed the shape of the story I'd been telling myself. I asked Claire why she was telling me all this now. She said, quietly, that she'd watched her mother let her sister die rather than let this family lose money, and she wasn't going to watch it happen twice. I stood in front of the entire family with Diane at my side, and told them my lawyer had copies of everything from that folder, the original fraud documents, the settlement, and a formal request to reopen the investigation into Vivian's death. Margaret's voice went cold with barely controlled panic. She asked if I would really drag this family's name through a courtroom over an old accident. I told her I'd drag their name through a courtroom because they'd built an empire on a lie and were willing to bury a second woman to keep it standing. I wasn't asking her for permission anymore. I was telling her what happened next. For the first time in this entire story, Daniel stepped forward and chose me openly, in front of his mother. He told her it ended now. All of it. I watched 40 years of careful, quiet control collapse in about 90 seconds, because one person in that room finally decided the truth mattered more than the family name. Here's what happened after. The settlement was reopened. My family's original 50% claim was validated in mediation 8 months later, not because I'd married into money, but because the original fraud, once exposed, couldn't survive daylight. My father's debt, it turned out, was the smallest number in this entire story. Vivian's case was reopened too. I won't tell you it ended in the justice she deserved. Some doors, once closed for that long, don't open all the way. But it opened enough. Daniel and I are still together, not because a lawsuit tied us there anymore. We made sure of that, but because somewhere in 6 weeks of chaos, something real actually grew, tangled up in all the wrong reasons. We're still figuring out if that's enough to build a life on. Some days I believe it is. People ask me if I regret signing that contract. I don't, not anymore. Because I walked into that family thinking I was the price being paid. I walked out of it as the debt finally being collected. If this story kept you up tonight, comment part 2 below, because there's more of this family's secrets I haven't told you yet. And if you made it all the way to the end, hit subscribe. I've got more stories like this one waiting for you.